All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is the first part of chapter 16, our lecture, and so I will just kind of get into things. Okay, you should have your book in front of you, notebook, something to write with, all that jazz, and then the lecture, the PowerPoint, however, whatever format you have it on your computer or accessible. Should have all those things going, and I will be your audio guide, okay? So if you have your PowerPoint in front of you, you'll see that this is chapter 16, like I said, America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. And this map is of Indian Territory, because in this chapter we will get into this point in time. So Indian Territory, the opening of the unassigned lands, and the Oklahoma Land Run. So if you look at this, you can see the section that will become, or what is the unassigned lands and becomes Oklahoma Territory. So looking at this map, we have Cheyenne and Arapaho Territory here on kind of the west side. And then next to it, there's this strip that kind of looks like a T, sort of. And there's nothing really written on that. And then next to it, you can see Iowa and Potawatomi, the nations. So that open area is what will open up for non-Indigenous settlement, and that's where the land run will be. And that's basically where Guthrie, Oklahoma City, of all of that is right there, smack dab in the middle. So that's where we are. All right. Looking at our first slide here. Okay, so this section is entitled The Second Industrial Revolution, which is what this time period is referred to as because of the way our factory system and industrialization kind of exploded and took on this whole new tone, okay? Oh, there's a typo right off the bat that I noticed. Cool, okay. Alrighty, so this point in time is referred to, or like we know that there's the most rapid and profound economic revolutions happening. And as you can see that second sentence, there's just the word the. That should really just go with the second bullet point there. So, looking at the 1880 census, I should say for the first time, the majority of the workforce was non-farming. Okay, so America had been this agrarian nation for the most part, and factories and our industrial cities are starting to become more popular. All right, people are moving to cities, less staying on farms, and we'll kind of see that more through this chapter and the upcoming generations around really through World War I, kind of, okay? But so, that is shown in the census. People are moving into cities, all right? By 1913, the U.S. produced a third of the world's industrial output, so that shows factories just growing and growing. And of that number, so of this industrial output, the U.S. was putting out more goods than Britain, France, and Germany combined, all right? And a lot of this has to do with the amount of space and natural resources that were available in the United States during this time. Also a growing supply of labor as immigration, more people are coming over. And yeah, so in addition to that, there's then this expansion in and the need for all of these goods that are being made in our factories. So it's just kind of feeding itself, all right? And then there is a huge surge in population numbers in the Great Lakes region and Chicago, especially during this time, all right? So Chicago, the second city, becomes a big hub for us, all right? And really the reason a lot of that is able to happen is because of railroad expansion. And I know I kind of talked about that in the last chapter, but we really see it booming during this point in time, okay? And so there is a map, let me see. Okay, so if you're looking at the 6th edition, it is page 473 for you. If you're looking at the 5th edition, it's 479, but the map is the Railroad Network 1880. So just to show how much this, I mean, it's reaching coast to coast, all right? Allowing people to travel quicker, goods to be shipped back and forth. Okay, so that is really what is able to help fuel the second industrial revolution, okay? All right, so looking at this first bullet point on the slide I have about the railroads, it's important to note that as these railroad companies are moving west and expanding their networks, they are taking land from indigenous people, okay? So that happens, you could look at any area in the country and that's happening, okay? All right, also during this time, and this is reflected in that map if you have that pulled up, but time zones are created by these companies during this time. The railroad industry, okay. So yeah, that's the beginning of that. And like I said, we have lots of people moving into cities. So between 1870 and 1920, so that's a 50-year difference, 11 million people would do just that and move from farms to cities, okay? I also said that lots of people are immigrating to the United States, and you have that number there. So 25 million people, again, during that 50-year time period, 25 million people came over to the United States. Okay, and then there's my note about the map that we already looked at. Okay, like I said, people moving into cities, in addition to railroad construction and immigration, our market for consumer goods is just growing and growing and growing, right? Okay, also during this time, there is a lot of innovation happening. So think of, like I said, with our railroads, but there are a lot of scientific breakthroughs and technological advancements that are occurring. So there is the Atlantic Cable, that reaches across the Atlantic Ocean, 1866. This is our telegraph cable, all right? So people can now communicate between the United States and Europe, so that's huge, all right? Also, eventually the telephone is created, so going off the telegraph technology, when people can actually talk. The typewriter is invented, which speeds up written communication. And electricity will come about during this time, which will completely revolutionize everything, all right? So those are just some of the things coming about during this era that are changing everyone's existence, all right? All right, where are we at? So workers' freedom in an industrial age. All right, so between 1880 and 1900, an average of about 35,000 workers lost their lives every year at their place of employment, okay? So this is mostly factories and mines that we're talking about. And this number was the highest in the industrialized world, all right? So this was very noticeably very much an American problem, okay? So workers are becoming aware of the situations that they're being placed in during this time. This will inspire further generations, but this is really the beginning of this kind of workers' movement, right? Class divisions become more noticeable as a lot of these business owners and people who already have wealth just accumulate more and more wealth, and those who are impoverished become more and more impoverished because of the situations they're placed in. Okay, so our class divisions become more visible. The wealthiest of our classes purposely are seeking, the most aristocratic lifestyles. And this is really kind of brought to the public by a man named Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives. And this came out in 1890, and he was really focused on the poor in New York, all right? He's also a photographer, so he goes around and he's documenting some of these conditions that people are living in and writing this story about, yeah, how the other half lives. So bringing a lot of this, like I said, to the public consciousness for the first time, all right? And so if we look at these next few images, most of these are Jacob Riis photographs, all right? So let us look. Okay, so the late 1800s is known as the Victorian era, and this is Queen Victoria, all right, and her family, and they literally set the tone for this whole time period, all right? Everything she does becomes super fashionable. Everyone just wants to kind of copy what the royal family is doing. All right, so the Victorian era. So you can look at this family photo here. So this is probably turn of the century. But anyway, so this is the royal family, the ideal, okay? And so let's look at these next photographs. Like I said, these next ones are all Jacob Riis images. So this is what he's letting people know is going on in the world, all right? So are people living in one-room apartments? As you can see, no ventilation, okay? So just looking at this, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, possibly 7, all right? This next picture, you know, small boys sleeping on steps. Next picture, more children. Sorry, as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to, I'd always thought this was an exterior shot because it looks like a sidewalk. It does, yes. So more children on the streets of New York. Okay, and then this last image is another family in New York living in a very tight living space, all right? But so there is this change going on, not only in the United States, but across the world, trying to talk about these injustices that are being placed on average people, okay? So society, all right? Okay, so let us move on to our next section. Okay, so the transformation of the West. Yeah, and then in your book there's a Jacob Riis photograph also that kind of shows that juxtaposition between our classes, right? Okay, transformation of the West. All right, like I said, all of these companies are moving westward, trying to expand their enterprises, and this comes at the expense of indigenous communities, all right? So indigenous land is being taken through different means. I mean, you know, every area is different based on what territory or state and their laws are, but so indigenous land is being taken through different wars, treaties, okay? And it is then redistributed, put that nicely, through different land sales, all right? This is how we will get to the land run, the first of 5 land runs in Oklahoma, but alrighty. So like I said, these companies are getting this land, they're redistributing it to farmers, railroads, and mining companies, okay, to make that money. And then there is also the development of large commercial farming. So whenever you think about the farms in California now, those huge plots of land, or bonanza farms, that kind of occurs during this time, all right? Okay. So farming in the Trans-Mississippi West, this is our next slide. Okay, bonanza farms, like I just mentioned. Good, I will get into that. Okay, so more land during the Gilded Age, so we're talking 1870, 1890. More land came into cultivation during the 30-year time period after the Civil War. So like I said, where we are right about for our studies. So more happens in that 30-year time period than the previous 250 years, okay? So that acceleration of building and moving and expanding is just going quicker and quicker. This all has to do with, or partially due to the Homestead Act, encouraging non-Indigenous settlers to go west. And they're essentially given land if you can better your plot over a 5-year period. It still exists in some places, but anyway. Alrighty, so that encourages people to go west. And like I said, that's whenever we get our bonanza farms. So our big, huge farms in California, all right? They are thousands of acres in size. And this becomes really, the way of the future, right? That is not the norm by any means. Most farms remain small, but this is considered that ideal in farming, okay? So something that we see during this time, and this is a pattern that will develop kind of going in through the Great Depression when it really implodes on itself. But so farmers become more and more dependent on banks to get loans in order to get more land, get better and newer equipment, all right? I know that I talked last time about our sharecropping system and the cropland, about this system that just keeps farmers down. Okay, so now there is a model of keeping farmers down by encouraging them to always get the newest innovations in farming equipment when it doesn't necessarily need to be the way. But so farmers begin taking out more and more loans, and we'll see this just get more and more in debt to a lot of our banks and larger companies. So that will unfortunately be a problem that will affect a lot of farmers in the United States, okay? All right, so looking at the West still, it's fair to say at this point we can consider it the corporate West because, like I said, all of these companies, railroad companies, they're running the show, all right? In addition to that, there is the image of the cowboy, and that's really what people associate with the West, all right? I'm sure, those of us from Oklahoma, knowing that if you go anywhere else in the world, people ask you about cowboys, and there are a lot of misconceptions about Indigenous Americans and lifestyles here and domiciles, aka our houses. Anyway, I won't get into all of that, but misconceptions, all right? The image of the cowboy is part of that, all right? So the cowboy became a symbol of this life of freedom on the open range, but in actuality, these were low-paid, wage-working, most often men. But yeah, it wasn't this romanticized story that's kind of been developed over time, okay? Alrighty, so by the mid-1880s, farmers had enclosed more and more open range with barbed wire. Barbed wire is invented at this point in time, and becomes very widely adopted, all right? So more land is just being enclosed by barbed wire, and rather than these cattle drives that they had done in the past, they began using the railroad system to move cattle, all right? Okay, yeah, this is still considered to be the golden age of the cattle kingdom. All right. Okay, we are still talking about westward expansion and railroad related things. And this was in our video a little bit, but Chinese immigration during this time rises, and unfortunately, yeah, like we saw in our video, the presence of these Chinese immigrants was often met with animosity and bigotry and hatred. And so we kind of see, yeah, we definitely saw the story of the man who came over and was robbed and assaulted and eventually goes back to China because it didn't work out for him. Anyway, so that kind of hitting on that violent tone towards immigrants, okay? But so, following the Civil War, Chinese immigration began to, like I said, increase. Our immigrants worked in a variety of industries, and a lot of this centered around the railroad, okay? Physically building the railroad system, but then also going to new towns that were developing along the way, running laundries, restaurants, also working in the mines that we're talking about, farming, agricultural, even in our factory systems, okay? So, basically saying the Chinese voice in the American West is something that is deeply, deeply rooted in that story and doesn't always get talked about very much, all right? Okay, let me see. So sorry, not trying to waste time. I'm just trying to make sure that that you guys kind of always know where I am at. Okay, well anyway, so I am looking at the subjugation of the Plains peoples. Okay, so the incorporation of the West into the national economy, like I've just been repeating with the railroad and all of these industries. This, and going back to what I said, it meant that this would be built on indigenous land, right? So this spelled doom for the Plains peoples, right? And there is an increase in violence, particularly against Plains communities and the army and settlers. So this goes from the 1850s until 1890, all right? Looking at the bison population, which is depleted as settlers move west, there was a population of about 30 million in 1800, and by 1890, bison were virtually extinct, all right? They were considered endangered for quite some time. Their populations were rebuilding over the last few generations now that people realized what a problem this was. But yeah, by 1890, we almost lost, bison were almost extinct. Okay, so if you look at this next picture, this is a stack of bison skulls, okay? Just to show you the number that I'm talking about, all right? So look at this guy here. Let's imagine he's 6 feet tall. So 6, 12, 18, 24, 30. So this is like 40 feet tall, all right? Give or take. But anyway, so that is just to illustrate the severity of that attack on the bison population, which was also such a staple for our Plains peoples, all right? Not only as a food source, clothing, just different aspects, all right? But so this was a huge issue during going up until 1890, like I said, okay? Okay. All right, so our next slide, let me be a free man. This is a quote from Chief Joseph, who was the leader of the Nez Perce Nation, all right? So our Nez Perce, they were chased over 1,700 miles before they eventually surrendered. They were removed to Oklahoma. And Chief Joseph, he spoke to the U.S. government in 1879, petitioning for the Nez Perce to be able to return to their homeland in Oregon. Right? So he was quite a voice during this time, okay? All right, so I am gonna skip ahead just a little bit, just for time's sake, okay? So Chief Joseph represents the Nez Perce. This can be applied to just about every nation, okay? So you can look at the Sioux, Cheyenne. We're talking about Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. So for those of you who are doing your research on topics related to this, look at those voices, okay? Alrighty. Let's see, this mentions Custer. So this is considered to be the tail end of the Indian Wars, all right? And this kind of marks this beginning of the remaking of Indigenous life, all right? Which is something that we'll get into, not just now, but in our upcoming chapters too. But so let's look how some of these issues kind of came about, all right? So 1871, Congress eliminated the treaty system and established our Indian boarding schools, all right? Those of us who are from Oklahoma have probably heard about Indian boarding schools. This was created by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The majority of these were in Oklahoma, although some are elsewhere. And really the sole purpose of this was forcing Indigenous children to assimilate to a European model, all right? So the Indian boarding school system, that is something that we will see continuing for a couple of generations. There's the Dawes Act, right, which broke up Indigenous land into small parcels, intended to have, it was basically for each family to have their own plot of land to farm, okay? No more communal lands is the point of the Dawes Act, all right? And so with that is how that center, the unassigned lands, comes to be about, is noticed, all right, and is then opened up for non-Indigenous settlement with the Oklahoma Land Run, okay, and that is how the state of Oklahoma eventually comes about. So the first land run, like I said, there were 5 total. Oops. Okay, but this is on April 22nd, 1889. It establishes Guthrie as the capital city, and approximately 50,000 people participated that day. Okay, so 50,000 people flooded into this area, all right? Okay, so looking at allotment and still the Dawes Act. So those who accepted these farms and I quote, adopted the habits of civilized life, end quote, received recognized citizenship as U.S. citizens, okay? So 53,000 people accepted that farming opportunity, or for lack of a better term, I will say opportunity, and accepted this citizenship in such a way. But it wouldn't be until 1924 that all First Americans receive a recognized citizenship from the United States government. Okay, 1924, all right? Okay. So, this next slide, so land rushes, like I said, that is really the way Oklahoma Territory is then expanded upon, right? And because of that opening up of this land, First Americans lost between 86 and 136 million acres, all right? Okay, and so 1890, why do we keep bringing that date up? Well, it is significant. Alrighty, we are looking at South Dakota, all right? And this is December 29th, 1890, all right? So right above this I have the Ghost Dance, which the Ghost Dance was a religious revitalization campaign. So you can read about that in your book a little bit in some more detail. But so, December 29th, 1890. U.S. soldiers opened fire on ghost dancers who were encamped at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And they massacred, our U.S. soldiers, they massacred between 150 and 200, mostly women and children. And so this is considered to be the end of the Indian Wars, okay? So this marked an official end of 4 centuries of conflict, all right? Actually, no, I don't think I mentioned this with you guys. Okay, but so our indigenous population, by the time we get to 1900, it is at 250,000 people overall. Every indigenous nation is represented in that number, all right? So that just shows, you know, truly how violent so much of our history is, and how terrible that was for our first American communities, okay? But, and on that note, you can look at, and that is probably for the 5th edition, so let me see. Yeah, so if you're looking at the 6th edition, it's page 500, 5th edition's 496. But I just want you to look at this map of Indian reservations circa 1890. So that just shows kind of how much land had been taken from these nations and how much, how restricted they had become. But yeah, so you can spend some time looking at that, all right? And if you're looking at the slideshow, right after this slide, I have pictures of Chief Joseph and Sitting Bull. Anyway, so this marks, yeah, the end, like I said, that official end of conflict, and it's just so sad. It's just so sad how all of that has affected so many people for so long, but anyway. Okay, so that is kind of where the chapter switches topics and gets into politics in the Gilded Age. And so that's where I will consider it our halfway mark, all right? Okay, Wild West stuff. I guess that's kind of what I hit on. Anyway, I can pick back up from there. Anyway, we will end it for now, and I will be back to continue this chapter and finish it up. So, if you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.